Thank each and every one of you for coming out here to this crowded presentation. No, thanks so much for having me speak here. I felt terrible when I couldn't make it last month. I was going to talk a little bit about my experience at the CNCF event, KubeCon, and then I caught COVID and couldn't make it. So thank you all for having me here this time. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about reducing security alert fatigue and focusing on what matters. Before I dive into this, just a little bit about me. John Richards, Head of Developer Relations at Paladin Cloud. I've been living here in the Midwest now for about 15 years. Love the place, love St. Louis here. So love that we've got a tech meetup group that's right here in St. Louis. I'm excited to share. I launched my first episode of my podcast today. So Sentries, check it out. All right, that's my little plug there. I also love board games, fun stuff like that. So, you know, if you're into that, let's hang out sometime. All right. Enough about me. Oh, let's see if I can actually advance my slides here. There we go. All right, so talking about reducing security alert fatigue. There's a lot of alerts out there in the space, a lot of things. And so the idea here is going to be talking about, well, how do you reduce that? And why does that matter? Because we want to really focus our attention. We only have a limited amount of attention span, a limited amount of time in the day. So we got to really focus on what's going to matter, what's going to be most important. To do this, we're going to walk through a few things. I'm going to start talking out about the proliferation of tools. There's so many tools out there right now. Then I'll discuss a little bit about how that's driven this idea of information overload. Then we'll talk about this challenge of how DevOps and security teams have become siloed. Communication's a challenge there. And what I'm going to posit is that what we need to help solve this problem is a centralized source of truth that these teams can use. We'll look at how open source can come to the rescue here, some options for that, the value of extensibility and customization that open source can bring. And we'll see how security isn't just a security team thing, how that can empower DevOps practitioners. And then we'll wrap up by, I'll show a little demo of open source in action. All right, so to start with is this idea of proliferation of tools. And I probably don't need to convince any of you about this, but there are a ton of tools out there in the ecosystem right now. I don't know if anybody's had a chance. Probably have seen the CNCF landscape. When I went to check this, recently, I saw there's now a new version here. Let's see if it plays well. Look at this. I like it. All the logos are a little bigger, full screen, because I always wanted to see as many logos on the page that have that impact. And we can just see that even just within the kind of CNCF landscape here, there is so many different tools. And most likely, wherever you're at, you're experiencing this. I talk to different folks, and it's not surprising for teams to say that they're working with upwards of 50 tools at their job. Not all of them specifically always track, but between Slack and all of our project management tools, and then we have all of our tech tools, and now we're seeing security tools begin to be layered on top of this. We can see in here, we've got this security and compliance section. We'll kind of just zoom in on this for a second. And we can see that there's still a ton of stuff just within the CNCF landscape that is around this idea of security and compliance. Coming back here, so we've got this proliferation of tools, and we're trying to use them to solve all of these important problems. But there's a lot of them. And one of the things you could say is like, okay, well, maybe we just need to use one tool, or there's some folks trying to do mega tools. But one of the reasons that there's so many tools is that there's value in that. And so I want to talk about three things here on why sometimes it's worth having more tooling, even though it can get overwhelming. One of those is that folks are looking for best in breed. You can go out there and say, hey, I'm going to try to do one thing, get one tool that can do everything. But I don't know if you've had this experience. If you go to a restaurant that has too many menu items, you start to question, hey, maybe they don't do any of this super well. One of my favorite places, you go in, they had 2 items on the menu. They had a cheeseburger and they had French fries. And you knew they made an amazing cheeseburger because that's the only thing you could get. So if it wasn't great, they weren't going to stay open. So sometimes folks are saying, I want best of breed. What's the best tool in this space? I'm willing to take on the extra burden of an extra tool because this is the best tool for the job. Another thing in there is folks get a little worried about this idea of vendor lock-in. If you start to only use one single tool, or you start to align too much just with just one thing, or kind of a mega platform some folks look at, you start to worry about, hey, if they change their licensing requirements, if they suddenly move the product in a direction you don't want, you're now locked into that. And either you might get a bunch of fees that you now have to deal with, or maybe you have to spend a whole bunch of development effort now to try and move away and migrate somewhere else. So lock-in's a risk that folks are worried about. And another piece here is just open source. And so by that, open source, just by its nature, tends to be an ecosystem play. That's why it's the CNCF here has such an amazing amount of tooling here, is because it's open source. These community pieces working together, focused on individual projects, and then we find ways, common language that we can speak for them to talk together. And so open source brings this value. It's community-based. So that's another reason we see a lot of tools, is if you're in the open source space, you say, hey, what's an open source tool that can do this? That plays well with what I'm already doing. Now, in addition to this amount of tools, let's see. This was my slide to remind me to go look at the landscape, which we already saw that. All right. In addition to the huge amount of tools, that means each of those tools is sending us messages. Just in my personal life, the amount of notifications I get on my phone as I download more and more apps has started to get crazy. I open up my phone and there's just this list of notifications. What do I do with them? And we have a similar thing as all these different tools that we're getting. And it's here specifically, I'm talking mainly about security tooling. But as we begin to pull in different security tools and start to use those, and they do their job well, they start to tell us, hey, here's a problem. Maybe it's really important. Maybe it's not that important. But we now have this information flowing into us. And as we adopt another tool and another tool, all of a sudden, all of these are now sending in information that we need to think about, that we need to work with. And so teams, as they start to get all this information flowing in, are left with, they kind of have two options here. On one end is, you say, hey, there's so much information coming in, I can't process this. I'm just going to ignore it. And that obviously doesn't work well. One, what's the point of the tool if you're ignoring it? And then the second piece is, as you ignore something, something terrible happens because nobody did anything, and there's a problem. The other end of trying to handle this information overload is to say, we're going to try and do everything here. And some teams are able to pull that off, but I often find that's teams that have a ton of resource thrown at it. They have very experienced teams, and they're not that large of an organization. I've talked to folks who say, we keep our queues at 0, and I laud them for that. But the majority of folks I talk to, that's not a realistic option for them. One of the sessions I went to at KubeCon that I really enjoyed, one of the security guys from Red Hat was speaking, and he was talking about, he handled security at Red Hat and was talking about how they approach this. And one of the things he was saying is, in general, when they go to fix a CVE vulnerability, they think about it as that costs $1,000. And so when you start thinking about that and you say, well, if I want to fix everything that came out last year, you're talking about like $1 million. And so instead you might say, I want to fix just critical. Well, maybe that's $200,000. And so as we think about this idea of fixing everything, the cost of that is a very real thing. The resources that we need to apply to it. And so teams that go all in will often experience burnout, or they are wasting resources as they try to fix everything. So teams generally, though, aren't fully all the way in or all the way out. Instead, they kind of exist on this spectrum where you are somewhere in between that, where you try to say, hey, I'm going to look at the notifications that I'm getting, and I'm going to think about this and say, is this important? Is this something, like, what's the risk level associated with this? And I'll try to remediate those. And the ones that I don't think is risky, I'm going to let those go through. But that sliding spectrum is where the challenge is. It's how do you know? How do you differentiate between those two things? And people are trying to do this, but what we see is that teams are struggling to be able to keep up with all of this. They've got notifications coming in from all their different cloud providers. They might have on-premise notifications coming in. They might be using different security tooling here. I've got vulnerability scanners, app code scanners. They might have a DSPM sending information, a CSPM sending information in, and it just starts to really overwhelm. It's a ton of information. The statistics show that teams are still getting breached. They're trying to use all these tools, but they're still having vulnerabilities happen, and often from simple things that could have been fixed, but that got missed or overlooked. And we're also seeing that, the statistic here was 83% of security professionals are experiencing this idea of alert fatigue, as this huge amount of information is coming in. And under the weight of this idea, it gets compounded when we think about who's dealing with this. So you have, at a lot of organizations, you've got a security team, and then separately, you've got the folks out there building applications that are doing this kind of DevOps work, building out in the cloud, and working in that space. And there's often this kind of silo that forms between them. I talk to a lot of DevOps practitioners who have no access to the security tools that the security teams are using. So they kind of get some information that gets tossed over to them, and they're left to deal with that. And so that siloing creates some challenges. So here are kind of 5 challenges that come out about that. So the first one there I already mentioned was that separate tooling. Without being able to see that tooling, that creates a problem where now, how do you pass that information over? And often that's different reports that don't have enough context. I've been a developer on the receiving end of this, where the security team sent me over and said, hey, here's a giant PDF with all the different vulnerabilities and things we scanned from the recent work that you did. And there just wasn't enough information in there. There was some information that said, hey, here's a problem, but I didn't have the context. And to get more information required writing an email back to that team to say, hey, what's going on? Can you tell me more about what you mean by this? And that creates this delay in response times. As the team receiving that says, I don't know what to do. This is a lot of information. And then they may not act on it as quickly. And so then you have this back and forth as you try to communicate this information. You also deal with false positives, because if you're sent something, a lot of times I would be sent something and they say, hey, here's a problem. And I write back and say, no, it's not a problem that's exposed. That's holding resources for our public website. So we don't have to worry about that one, even though it normally would be an issue. So you have to sort out and weed out these false positives because there's not enough contextual data there. And then can also be a challenge around remediating those problems. So this lack of how do I fix it? Sometimes I would get a report, there was an issue with something that they were like, hey, somebody can have access here. Or maybe it was even just a vague code. And I would say, I don't know what this is. I'm going to go and try and Google that and see if I can find the right answer. And maybe you can tell me, is this even something I have access to fix? Does this really need to go to a different team member? And so this challenge where security teams and DevOps teams kind of throw stuff over a wall really slows things down and creates can create a culture of hostility where they feel like every time there's a breach or there's a problem, the security team comes in and says, look, we told them about it. Right here is where it is. And then the developers come in and they say, yes, but you also told us 100,000 other issues about the site that were never exploited. So how do we know which one to really pay attention to? And so in this space, what's needed is this idea of a centralized source of truth, something that both teams can look at and understand that they're on the same page, that they're using the same information. And in this, there's a few different things here that are important to be able to do. So the first thing is just being able to identify what's going on. So you're looking at how do you visualize and manage any of the different risks that are across your cloud environments, across any of your tooling. You need to first identify what those are. Then the next step is figuring out how do you correlate this? How do you get the context that you need to be able to make those important decisions? The third piece here then comes into priority. Once you are able to know what the problems are and you have figured out the context for that, you're in a much better place to sit down and say, what's important to us? What do we need to make sure that we fix first? What's most risky? What's going to be something we need to worry about right now? And what can wait down the line to be able to be fixed? And then lastly, you want to go fix those things. And so that might look like handing this over to some remediation workflow. It's figuring out how do you get the information to be able to know how you're going to remediate these problems. So there's a few ways to do this. One way is going to be looking at open source, but there's a lot of ways to try and tackle this kind of problem here. Folks are trying to solve this, I should say. And so I've talked to a lot of teams that are using different things. I've talked to folks who are taking all of this and dumping it into a giant database of some kind. They take all this tooling, put all this information somewhere, and then they say, we're going to route this out to create our own system internally to be able to do this. I talked to a team that has they have 30-some spreadsheets that they use to manage the security findings from across other different tools, and then they share these different spreadsheets out to specific teams to use it. And so teams are actively out there trying to do this because it's the next step that you need. You need a way to centralize this. But I would like to talk a little bit about how open source can maybe help us with this. Before I do that, I will just to show here, since we're talking about this, here on the CNCF piece, let's see. I should have prepared to where I needed to look to find the logo for Paladin Cloud here. Probably everybody. I know there's so many in here. Oh, here we go. And all right. Oh, man, now I can't get. All right, my view from here is not playing nicely. I probably need to hit it then in this. I just was going to show the Apache 2 licensing that we're using and the link to the GitHub. So this is an open source project listed on here that I should have prepared to click through on here a little bit easier. But so I wanted to explain what is Paladin Cloud and why am I talking about it here as an open source solution for this. So Paladin Cloud, here is the kind of Git history for this. It started out as a tool called Packbot at T-Mobile. So T-Mobile was dealing with this exact same challenge. The team over there, the Cloud Center of Excellence, so not the security team, but the DevOps team, was struggling. They were having some of those stories I was talking about where a breach would happen, they would get pulled up and then they'd be told, hey, we told you about this problem, and they're like, you told us all these. So they wanted to really empower their developers to be able to handle this. So they started a project there to be able to do this. Packbot stands for Policy as Codebot. And they worked on this for a while, and eventually, as we can see here in early 2019, they open sourced this project. They did that for a while, which was great. People started to use it, and eventually, they no longer could support the project, so it kind of died away, unfortunately. And then, so we can see here, last year, the designer of the original Packbot started Paladin Cloud and was able to take over the project, kind of modernize the infrastructure underneath it, and begin running this now kind of with the new name, with the blessing of T-Mobile to run this as an open source project, joined CNCF. So that's kind of the history of this. And it was meant to solve some of this problem that we're seeing out there. All right. And the reason for this was those developers wanted to have access. So the idea behind this was, let's build something that's able to pull in all of our different assets, all the different things we're using across all the different cloud providers, and then let's have some kind of level policy that we can look at those, but that will be available to everybody on the team. So that was kind of the beginning of this project. And what was found was, hey, this is pulling in some value, but you know what? This specifically was doing some was finding misconfigurations, but they also had vulnerability tools. And this need to say, hey, we don't want just another tool added to the mix. How do we begin to pull all of these tools together? And that's where this idea of the value of extensibility and customization comes in. And so it was built with this kind of extensibility in mind. So you could build a custom plugin. So you could go out and build something, connect it in. And then, of course, the value of open source is that if you build a plugin for a tool, now somebody else can use that same plugin to connect for them. And so the idea here is we're looking for folks to help contribute to the project, build plugins to their favorite tools that will pull in data and kind of centralize that to this central spot. And from there, you can give out access wherever it needs to go. And so here, kind of focusing back on those four things, one of those is to increase visibility. So you've got this kind of real-time monitoring that enables developers to identify those vulnerabilities and misconfigurations that are pulled in from all these different third-party tools. And you're able to do that via creating custom policies and plugins. So you can hook in your different tools into this. And then there's the prioritization step. So now that you've got all of this information that you found, all these security vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, all these different pieces, you can now score them against one another and say, what do we want to focus on? You can have those discussions that are really important and talk about those. And then, sorry, my slide looks a little weird here. I switched them over from PowerPoint to Google because PowerPoint broke today, and then some of my formatting's off here. So thanks for your patience. And the last piece is, kind of accelerating that remediation. links off to libraries on how to remediate, and you can push things over to some workflow tools. And the reason this is important is security isn't just for the security team. It's really about how can you empower the DevOps practitioners out there who are working on this. And what they found, what I've seen working on this project is if you just toss things over the wall, things don't happen, and you get this combative atmosphere. But if you're able to take a tool and give the developers access, the thing is, developers want to build secure code, but they often don't have the feedback in the real-time method that they need to be able to do so. So if you're able to give them that access, empower them to go in and say, oh, here is all the things that are important to me. Here's what I need to do to make that secure. They'll go do that. They want secure code. So this allows you to really let your team own that piece of it. And you may have heard this in the open source space. People like to use democratize a lot, but I think of it as democratizing the security at your organization. Instead of it being owned by a single team there, how can you say, let's all of us own security? How can we make it so that each team is responsible for their own security versus saying, hey, I hope I hear back that things are good, and I'll let that team handle it, and I'll just build whatever I want. All right, so here I'll just run through a quick kind of demo of what I'm talking about. That will show a little bit of what how Paladin Cloud works in the space. So this here is Paladin Cloud, completely free, open source. You can go to the GitHub repository, download it, you install it, and you connect it. Here are the different plugins. So you would connect in and say, hey, I'm running on AWS, Azure, GCP, and then it will pull in all of your assets from that. That's why I'm starting here. And then you can see we've started to build out this library of third-party plugins. We've got more in development. We've got Qualys, Aqua, Red Hat, Tenable right now, but some more on the way. And those tools that are out there pulling in this idea of like, this tool doesn't do vulnerability management, but you're able to use those if you're using Kubernetes. Maybe you're using ACS, maybe you're using Aqua. You're able to pull that data in here into that central spot, kind of compare everything together. All of this then rolls up into this idea of an asset. And this is the underpinning behind, let's see, not the summary, let's go to the distribution. The underpinning behind Paladin Cloud is bringing in all of your different assets. And here I'm looking at a list that goes across all of our cloud providers. So we've got 3 different ones here. This is kind of a heat map that shows all the different assets that we have. We can drill down into those if we want. But here, once we have all this information, we can now take all of the security findings from these different tools, map them to a specific asset. So we could say, oh, this is the piece that's vulnerable that we need to fix, that we need to do something with. One of the things I like about this is that you can break this down in a lot of different ways. So we can come in here. By default, the system gives you like, hey, I just want to look at my AWS kind of footprint. We can pull that up. But you can create your own. And so you can come in here and say, hey, we are running, we got this application. And this is where empowering developers really starts to come in. You can say, hey, for this development team, here is everything you're using, and everything gets contextualized just to that team. And most folks who are using this are going to be working from the dashboard. And so they can come in and say, for our application, how are we doing? How many critical vulnerabilities or misconfigurations are sitting out there? What's our footprint look like? And then, the security team can still come in here. We've got this option here, all cloud, that just to show a lot of data across it can come in and say, hey, actually, here's what our whole organizational footprint looks like. And we do see, as folks come in here and say, hey, this team has access to this, they want their numbers to improve, those values begin to go up. And so here at the top, we can see all of our different violations, critical, high, medium, low. Those are broken down by the group. There's a couple, you can have admins and you can have users in here, of course. There's the category. So security is really talking the bulk of things that are going to be in here talking about security. There's cost. There are some things in here you can track underused or unused assets, but it's not full cost management. But if you want some kind of light version, you can use that. Operations is really going to be about what region things are in. And then tagging. If you've got a large cloud of any size, tagging is how you manage that, and you don't lose track of things. So this is an important way to be able to say, do we have everything marked properly? Do we know where everything is supposed to go? All right. Over here, kind of showing just a graph of how you're doing that you're able to follow. You can look at trends for these if you want. over time, you want to see your compliance trending upwards as things get better. And over time, you want to see the amount of violations trending down towards zero. Here's a list of all of your assets. So you can see kind of over time what your footprint looks like. You'll often see certain cyclical natures in here, but sometimes you'll see a giant spike like this and it will force conversations. You say, why did we suddenly spin up a whole bunch of new things? So it can be really important for identifying anomalies as well. And from here, we can click through. So we've got these violations. We can come in here and say, hey, here's a list of all the critical violations at our organization, and come in here and talk about those, work on those to fix them. We can look at this deny HTTP request. We can see here that a violation, there's the status of it, how critical it is, what type it is, usually security, and then we've got here which cloud provider and what type it is. So this is an S3 bucket on AWS. And here we can link over to the specific policy if we want more information. That includes links on how to remediate. We can request exemptions. So we can say, hey, here's why I want to get this exempted, set a date. I'm an admin, so, I got to actually set a date on this. But we can say, hey, we're going to exempt this till tomorrow. Why is my date off? Anyway, you can, if you're a normal user, you would request one. When I do one, I would just add the exemption, and then you would see that kind of show up down here in the log as that gets processed. And then let's see, we'll come back here. I was talking about the importance of knowing what to focus on. So down here we have this policy compliance overview, and here we can see these are sorted by severity and the amount of violations. And so the usefulness of this is you can say what is the thing that that's in our top risk, but also that we have the most of. And the idea is that hopefully you can find a way to solve a bunch of these at once and really remove the most risk with the least amount of effort. So we can see this Azure Defender is an issue. So if we're able to go in there and we're saying, let's just enable it across all of these, we could clear out 15 of these here really quick that are on our highest risk and improve our score that way. So this is meant to say, hey, back to that idea of alert fatigue. We don't want to just be another place that gives you more alerts and warnings, but instead saying, well, hey, here's where you should focus. Let's find what's the most important and what we have the most of, and we can kind of remediate it that way and know where to focus in. And then one other thing here I wanted to mention was, let's see if I can find the one, is that these third-party tooling that we pull in here, let's see if I can find the one around Qualys. This one here for enabling Qualys is that this tool, because we have all those assets, we can provide extra value to the third-party tools that you're already using. So for instance here, EC2 that you might be running in AWS for compute instances, you want to install Qualys on. But organizations, while Qualys can tell you, hey, here's what all I'm scanning, it doesn't know what it's not scanning. So since you have this library, Paladin Cloud is able to tell you, hey, you're actually missing one of your EC2 instances because we can see all of them, and then we have the information from Qualys. We're able to find those gaps and tell you. So it adds this extra value to the individual ones that you're using. So that's the kind of overview. We've got at the high level here on the dashboard, we've got all these findings that we're pulling in from those different tools. We're kind of using that information, adding the context as we go in there for any one of these that we pick, like this deny access to this SSH port. So we're looking at this policy. We can see a list of all of these. We can go into it, and then we can say, hey, let's look at that actual asset, get all the information on it, so teams can drill down to the specific things that they would like to use. There's the list of the policies. You can see there's 400 and some already in here. You can write your own custom policies if you wanted to. Information on how you're doing tagging for the system. And then we have notifications that might get pulled in from third-party tools, some information from like AWS Trusted Advisor, and then the administration section where you can manage your users. You can create all those different asset type groups I talked about groups for different applications. You can create groups by different subscriptions or accounts, things like that. But yeah, the general idea is let's find a way to take all of this information, get it in the hands of the teams that are working on it. And because it's free, it's open source, you don't have to worry about licensing or C requirements. give it access to everybody on the team. They can come in, own their specific application, and create more secure products. And hopefully that gets us back to this idea of, hey, we're now less overwhelmed by the notifications. We know what they are. We understand the ranking of those, which ones we should be focusing on. So the next time something comes up, we can say, hey, look, here's what our specific application, what was important. Here's what we did to fix that. So just to recap here as we wrap up, we started out talking about how many different tools there are out there and how that leads to this idea of information overload as all this information comes in. And that's compounded as the DevOps teams and security teams struggle to be able to communicate back and forth. And the way to solve this is to have a centralized source of truth both groups can access and use. Open source is a great way to solve that, especially if you're able to extend it, customize it. As teams come in, there's going to be tools that aren't in this list that they're using, but they're able to build a plugin, contribute that to the community, and now there's another tool that's valuable for everyone. And then by taking this tactic of either whether you're using our tool or you're creating your own, the idea is you want to empower the folks out there building this so that they have access to the security information so that they can solve that as they're building applications instead of needing to wait till after everything's done and then go back in and try and solve this without any context. All right, thanks so much for listening. Check out the repository, give us a star. We appreciate you watching this. Have a great holiday if you're watching this soon. Otherwise, happy 2024. Thank you, guys.